Okay, welcome back, everybody, to the Metamorphic Side Productions podcast. I am your host, Hannah, and that is the co-host, Will, over there, and we are back with another God's Not Dead movie, Will.
I'm really hoping we're starting to run out of these.
Yeah, we have one more left after this. They might be making a new one. I haven't looked that up yet, but so far, we know there's 4. We're on the 3rd one, called A Light in the Darkness. But yeah. How are you doing today, Will? How's your lovely Sunday afternoon?
Well, the sun's beaming down into my eyes, so it's hard to see. So I'm not even sure if I know where I'm at right now. Am I anywhere?
We're at home. We're literally in our living room.
Okay, now I'm just gonna have to trust you because I literally can't see where I'm at.
So you're blind.
I need a light in the light.
A light in the light.
Maybe
a light in the darkness.
Maybe I need darkness in the light so I can get the shadows.
Wow. Okay. How do our eyes work? Do we need darkness in order to see? I know we need light in order to see.
Yeah, maybe we see a podcast if we find a podcast about science. We join them and we just ask them questions.
Well, this movie really has nothing to do with actually seeing with your eyes. It's it actually kind of departs completely from what the other 2 movies were about a little bit.
Not really. I mean, it's the same cliches, different movie, but they tweak some things in this movie to make it a little bit more palatable, palpable. But it's at the same time, it's still hard to sit through. They don't really do a lot to change anything.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that the 4th movie has something to do with homeschooling. We said when we were watching it, it feels like the actual end of the series. Like it felt like this is the end of the story. How are they going to continue it? We will find out next month.
Oh boy.
But okay, so we are going to just jump right in, start talking about God's Not Dead 3, A Light in the Darkness. And we're continuing on with the story of Pastor Dave. And
which, to be fair, the other 2 movies weren't even about him. So now we're just a background character is now the main character.
Right. And it's the, producer / not director, but he is the producer. But we do have a big studio now. We have Universal Studios is producing this movie. So
coming soon, next year, the God's Not Dead dark ride at Universal Studios.
Or the Halloween Horror Nights, they have like a God's Not Dead Hell House there.
They have cosplayers dressed up as David A.R. White
and Josh and the ghost of Professor Addison. And he's like, "Whoa, you should accept Jesus." That's unfortunately that happens in real life. There's some hell houses probably.
Oh, there are.
Right now active currently in this month.
We're not going to get into that because I have my own feelings about hell houses and redemption houses for Halloween. We're not going to get. That's another podcast for another day.
There's actually a documentary about it we could watch.
Nope. I'm good.
Okay. What are the 3 things that you want to point out first? And I will go first. Okay. Number 1, we have big studio money now. So with Universal, the little the globe pops up. And so they have much more money and resources now because they have Universal backing up for this movie. So how did they use it? I wrote down that you can tell that the cinematography, it's funny because we've noticed, so the cinematography is nicer and it looks more like a movie. Except with establishing shots, it's weird. It kind of goes back and forth between looking like traditional Hollywood movie back to how it was looking before they had the Universal Studios.
Basically, it looked like, here's a scene from a movie you would actually see in the theaters to here's a seniors project from high school that they have been working on for a little bit.
I would say TV movie level. It went from movie studio to TV movie sometimes.
More like TV specials that is from the 90s that's poorly recorded, but it's trying to teach you a message or
like a Hallmark movie. That's what I thought, a Hallmark movie.
There you go.
So I called it crispy. It's very crisp, some richer tones. I just noticed that our cat is freaking out right now. He's giving us a little show. Whenever we're highly involved in something like recording a podcast, Grayson has to take attention because he's no one's giving me attention now, so I have to do something. But anyway, so I noticed that the skin tones were richer and the colors and the palettes were nicer. And then there would be a random shot of them walking out of a building, and I'm like, wow, this looks like it was filmed on digital, not on film. I don't know if they used film.
It was filmed on a GoPro or something like that.
No, you can tell GoPro's huge. Do you remember that part in The Hobbit where they randomly filmed filmed like part of it on GoPro. Did you see that in the second one? They film a whole scene in the second Hobbit with like GoPro, and you can obviously tell it's really weird. And I said this, I wonder if when Universal approached them and they were like, hey, we want some of your Christian Hollywood money, that Dave A.R. White, or the guy that Pastor Dave, that guy, he was like, okay, I will do this, but you have to let me bring some Pure Flix people with me who also get to have a job. And like, so I think that his crew worked on like some of the scenes, and then some of the scenes they had like their own cameraman and cinematographer.
Okay, the perfect example of this, there's a scene where the pastor is walking with somebody, and in the first shot you see, the security guard in the shot is fuzzy, and he's just right there in frame, fuzzy. And then it cuts the same security guard. The next scene is like super crisp. You can see the detail of his uniform.
He's and also like the lighting on him is like, there's one part where he goes into a bakery, or like it's that lady who the love interest. He's bringing her like stuff for her ministry, and it's like looks all dusty, and you can see the light streaming in from the windows. And what they do in situations like that, they literally have like a smoke machine, like a fog machine, because they want the light to catch the little particles so you can see like the light coming in. And so I'm like, wow, like those details I can see. Even those little details I noticed. I was like, oh wow, they are like stepping it up. Just like it's like the little extra bit of oomph. So they had someone experience behind the camera and stuff like that was like there to make it look just that much better. And that had to be from Universal. That had to be from people who knew in the know-how, a lot of experience, but also they just had a little bit more money. You can tell that their lighting was better. Their cameras were better. It was just, yeah. Okay, number 2. So I said they're still suffering from rando character syndrome. So we get a whole new character. His brother, we didn't know he had a brother before. He's a lawyer. Just comes into the movie. He has a new love interest, was never in the other movies before this. They just throw random people now. It's like we're meeting all these new characters, and it just feels so, I kind of feel sloppy. It kind of feels like when you're first starting out writing a script and you're just like throwing new characters in and you don't quite know, especially with a third film in a series, which with characters who have come back, like hint, hint, not hint, hint, wink, wink. Josh is back. Josh from the first movie is back in this movie. He has a very minor role, but he is back. And so we have people who've been with us from the beginning, and now we have all these like new people, and for some reason, it just feels sloppy. It feels like, and there's the way they write him and his brother, it just is like, here's a bunch of exposition dump. It's like, here you go, boom, here's their backstory, here's them as brothers, he's a lawyer, boom, 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 boom. Okay, now the story has to happen. And it just seems like out of nowhere, a lot of this stuff gets dumped on us. And then number 3, they kill Jude. Oh my gosh. So if you remember from our lovely friends, the Foresters, who were on the first 2 with us, they both really like Jude, who was the South African maybe, missionary. And he gets killed off in the beginning of the movie. I'm not sure why they did that. I know it was they definitely used it for drama. They definitely used it for emotion, to put Dave's character, through it really. But I feel like it just felt crazy for him to die the way that he did. And then I said the ending, I think I'll talk about the ending the most when we get to the end of the podcast. We're talking about the message, but the ending is actually, this is the best ending so far, a message I've seen from the God's Not Dead films. And I'm excited to talk about that when we get there. But those are my top 3 things. So go ahead, Will. What are your top 3 things?
I think to finally give one of these movies actual kudos, actually like slow clap, they finally have a concise story. They finally have one singular story arc that actually matters. And they have like some side stories, but they all properly interconnect and make sense. They actually all flow together. It's kind of like, I hate giving imagery, but if you have like a river and then you have subsidiary little streams, the streams still matter because they all flow into the same river. The other movies, it was like, here's the main river, here's a couple streams. They don't really connect. So we'll get into that when we introduce the other characters. But when we're talking about these films finally having a concise story, a story that makes sense, but that everything goes together, morphs together into one solid singular narrative. I think that's important. I think another thing was that I consider these movies convenience the movie. And so I call this Convenience 3 Life in Unreality. So what I mean by that is that at the end of the movie, there's this huge protest that's very similar to actual protests you see nowadays on the news. Picket signs and people shouting and filming things. And it was two sides to an argument. One group was protesting the church, protesting Christianity. One group was pro-Christianity. And it was getting heated. People were like threatening to do violent things. People were threatening to hurt people. And then it was just like, okay, we're going to go home. We're going to be happy now. And that's just not reality. It's just convenient that it wraps up so beautifully. Or when Pastor Dave commits a crime that we're going to get into in a little bit, there was no consequences. Everybody forgets about it at the end of the film. When in reality, if he doesn't go to jail, then nobody's going to take him seriously anymore. His credibility as a pastor is damaged. Or, even when there's the college situation, that the college would have a reputation that's tarnished because of what happens on the campus. And so I think calling these convenience the movie is just because they have these wonderful stories, they have these elements to it, but then nothing happens with it. If something like a crime happens or a death happens or somebody's sick or somebody whatever, it all wraps up so pretty at the end, and there's no like lingering effect, especially since you're building technically a franchise. They're building a story with multiple movies. There's no consequences, and it kind of opens up with how I feel at the beginning of the movie. The movie begins with the pastor in jail because of what happened in the previous movie, which is fine. So the previous movie, he was brought to be a juror on the trial for the teaching. The teacher who was on trial for God's Not Dead 2. He was a juror. They found out he was a pastor. So they subpoenaed his messages because he found out the teacher was a member of his church, right? And so they were like, hey, we need to see your messages, so we're going to use them in court. That was the whole purpose of the subpoenaing of the messages. And then he decided, no, I'm not going to do that, because he took that as persecution. And so they're like, well, now you're preventing the court process from functioning normally. You're impeding our processes of a court, so you're going to jail. He goes to jail. He's in jail for 30 seconds of the film. They let him out, and then nothing happens with it. There's no references to it except for one time, and it's like a side note. There are no real references to what happens with it. There's no consequences. There's no emotional impact behind it. It's completely useless. It's completely does not add to the story. It's just there for dramatic effect.
Do you think that that's why they killed Jude off? Because they were like, oh, we need something that is like not going to just magically be fixed at the end of the movie? Is that like their attempt at like having something that, yeah.
When you do a character death in a normal movie that's not like a supernatural sci-fi film, character deaths are used as a tool to be like final climactic thing that's going to change the story forever. It's the one of the tropes that every movie kind of has to do eventually, or a franchise has to do eventually. And it's fine. It's good. It just, if it's not handled properly, it doesn't have the right emotional impact. And we'll kind of get into that. But again, when you deal with something that's like, this movie is set in a normal reality, like normal everyday life. When you set something in normal everyday life that other people experience something similar with, and then the things that happen in the movie that if they happen in real life would change people's lives forever, you expect something like that to happen in the movie. So when you deal with a person going to jail, or you deal with arson, you deal with crime, you deal with manslaughter like they do in the movie, there are supposed to be consequences.
It does still suffer, just like you said, from the everything's magically fixed in the end. Yeah.
Well, before we proceed, do you want to give like a brief like synopsis of the film? Because we're going to reference things that aren't going to make a lot of sense unless we explain it.
Sure. The quick synopsis is that it starts out with him going to jail because of him being subpoenaed for his sermons in the first movie, and he failed to do that, so he goes to jail, gets out of jail, and then he's with Jude, and they're talking about how the church is no longer welcomed on the campus. So we find out that St. James Church, the one that is in all these movies that Pastor Dave preaches at, technically on the campus from the first movie. So like the the college campus that Josh goes up against Professor Radisson, the church is on that land because historically it was built like 150 years ago. The church was built first, and then the university came later. And then I guess all this stuff that happened in the first two movies just put on the pressure, the heat, and also we find out that the church has a college campus ministry, which we never heard about before until this movie. You think that would have come up with in the first one. But basically, like, the students are like, we don't want Christianity on our campus anymore. We shouldn't have a church here. Plus all the stuff that happened before with the other two movies. And so they're like, you know what? We just want to buy the St. James Church from you. We'll buy it out. And then, you can just move and just leave. And Pastor Dave's like, hey, I don't want to do that. I want to stay. Also, like, this church has been here for 150 years. Like, do you really have the right to do this? And so they start fighting about it. And then the dean, I think it's the dean of the school, is technically friends with Pastor Dave. And he tries to kind of fight for him, and then he's like, really, like, you should just take the money because, like, my hands are tied. And then the university's like, hey, we're a big bad university, we'll force you, like, you can't afford to defend it. And then conveniently surprise, Pastor Dave has an older brother, and he's a lawyer, like I said, very convenient. And so Pastor Dave's brother comes, his name's Pearce, I think, comes and is starting to defend his brother's church, which we find out was his father's church. So, like, their father was the pastor there before Pastor Dave. And then they go to court over, are they going to keep the church there or not? Well, before all that happens, so people are protesting the church and all the stuff about it being a legal issue and whatnot. There's this whole other B plot story with this girl who we've never met before, but supposedly Pastor Dave and Josh know who she is. But she's like, hey, I don't know if I believe in Jesus anymore. I'm questioning my faith and all this stuff. And she has a boyfriend who is like, oh, I don't believe in God anymore anyway because of my traumatic past. She's struggling with her faith, and she ends up going back to St. James, to their college ministry, and talks to Josh a little bit. We find out Josh is there, that he quit law school to become to work on the college campus ministry. We have some comments about that later on. She basically feels that because she's hanging out with her boyfriend later, they're talking with her friends, and they kind of back her up into a corner, and they're like, are you Christian or are you not? And her boyfriend doesn't support her, and so she's like, listen, I think it would be best if we broke up. It's very, like, she's just like, hey, it's over, and then walks away. It's not really a dramatic scene. He gets so distraught about it and so angry that they're like, I think he gets drunk. Do they get drunk or high or something?
So I believe they go to a party that night, and I think it's clear that he's been drinking. And do you want me to pick up from here, or do you want to pick it over?
Yeah, you pick it up from here.
Okay. So he's all, mad and steamed about, his girlfriend breaking up with him. And then, he's just got this chip on his shoulder towards religion. And so he takes a brick and he throws it through the church window, and it conveniently hits a gas pipe that starts a gas leak, and Jude goes downstairs to the bottom of the church because he hears the commotion of glass breaking. He turns on the light. The light is actually defective. Because the light's defective, it starts a spark. The spark hits the gas. Explosion hits. Jude hits his head on the wall because of the explosion, knocks him back, and the pastor comes downstairs, finds Jude, drags him upstairs while the altar is catching on fire. I'll get to in a second, but it looks pretty bad. And then he holds him outside the church as Jude dramatically dies in about 10 minutes from a meh.
I think he dies at the hospital, technically.
Nope.
Okay.
He dies on the scene.
Yeah, and it's obvious that what he went through, because I think they were trying to keep it like PG or whatever, but he would have probably survived.
Or if not survived, he would have survived for probably a few hours.
Or days. Like, he does hit his head, but you would think like, oh, he would have like a concussion or something, unless something happened we didn't see internally.
Yeah, but he has a brief conversation with the pastor. So he's cognizant enough. Yeah, it just it's kind of like it's really rushed. It's like, oh, we don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this. We just want to make sure this character is, killed off, so there's emotional impact going forward.
Right.
And so the kid runs away.
He's not caught.
He's not caught. Does not know he killed a person. Does not know he actually set the church on fire. But he comes up to the next day. He sees it on the news that the church not only caught on fire, but one of the pastors is dead. And so now he's like scared for his life because he's like, oh no, they're going to find out that I killed this guy. I didn't mean to do that.
I think he has guilt because he knows he's not going to get caught unless he says something. But he has a lot of guilt that he caused someone to be killed.
So that's the kind of the trajectory. The pastor's now like, emotional. When the church catches on fire, the school's like, hey, guess what? Instead of repairing the church, how about we pay you money to just head on out? Just because there's already controversy with the whole religious thing on campus. We really want to use this ground since our church is on our property. We want to use it. We know you own it, but we really need to use this for our plans for the future. They do not say, hey, we do not want Christianity represented on our campus. They do not say we don't like Christianity. We're trying to push it out. We don't think it belongs here. At least not like that's not the reason why they're doing that. There's one or two people who are like, it's a PR thing. So they offer him money. He's like, no, this is persecution. You're just trying to push out Christianity. You're trying to silence my beliefs. And he's like, I'm choosing to fight for this. I believe God's calling me to fight this. And so he goes and gets his brother and they start a legal battle to try to find where it's legally against the law for them to ask them to leave the campus.
Right. And then, okay, so that's kind of caught up to where I was saying. And if you want to continue on to talk about the slander that goes on, there's a whole mudslinging thing between Pastor Dave and the dean.
It feels like I asked you to film a scene for a movie where you had two political candidates who are mild-mannered, but then they have to get a little heated. And so normally they have pretty even keel, nice attitudes, and all of a sudden they have to get a little bit steamy. And so they start saying mean things. And then basically there's a lot of push for the pastor to leave. The pastor's like, no, I'm going to actually film a campaign to get people on my side. So he gets a bunch of Christians on his side who decide threatening the life of the dean of the university.
Yeah.
So the dean of the university comes to Pastor Dave's house, tries to fight him.
Yeah, it literally comes swinging. They fight.
They start fighting, which I'm not even going to get into that. And then the dean leaves. Then Pastor Dave is like, trying to keep going with himself. And then he finds out through the student texts Pastor Dave saying, oh, I accidentally killed Jude.
And so he shows up and he's like, hey, and pushes him into some grass. And then
Pastor Dave goes on the university campus, finds the student and assaults him. and that's not brought to court. That's not,
they threaten it at one point.
That would just because it's in front of students, it's videotaped. You wrap that up and Pastor Dave finally forgives him. Then he has a moment at the very end where he's like, you know what, actually maybe I shouldn't be fighting this. I'm just gonna go ahead and we're gonna just move on out away from the campus and we're gonna start a new church
called St. Jude's.
And we want to promote peace and unity and love, and I forgive this student for what he did, and we're good to go. And the crowd who is protesting decides to leave. They're not like, hey, you just assaulted a student on campus and you also got in a fight with the dean. How are we supposed to accept you as a pastor of a church now? How are we supposed to continue seeing you as somebody we want to respect since you assaulted a student in a public place?
Yeah. And then we need to mention the dynamic between the brothers because Pearce, who is the lawyer who's helping his younger brother Dave, stopped believing or left his faith because he had doubts.
He had doubt. So the thing is with this movie is that if you're the girlfriend of the boy who committed the arson, it's okay to doubt. That's cool. But they flip back and they're like, oh yeah, Pearce, Pastor Dave's brother, started doubting his faith in college. His family decides to disown him, essentially, kick him out of the house, push him away because he questioned his faith. That forces Pearce to be like, well, if these people who I grew up with who were a pastor and then, Pastor Dave becomes a pastor, if that's supposed to represent Christianity in my eyes while I'm trying to just search for the truth, then I'm going to push that away. And so Pearce leaves the faith and tells that to Pastor Dave, like, you pushed me away from the faith. You told me that questioning my faith was a bad thing. Trying to seek the truth as a bad thing. And so they don't resolve that at all. Yeah. Pastor Dave does not apologize for that. Pastor Dave doesn't try to sit down with Pearce and walk him through that. Pearce just goes on with his life by the end of the film, still not believing and still having a chip on his shoulder that his family pushed him away because he was doubting the faith.
And I guess, to be fair, I mean, that is like a end that isn't so neatly tied up in a bow. Maybe a little bit more realistic.
But they should have the pastor of the church, like the main character. He apologized for other things, but he wouldn't apologize to his brother for how he treated him.
I think they implied, he was going to do it later off screen, but I could see where we needed that as an audience. Like, it could have served a really good purpose. The girl, whenever she doubts, I think she talks to Josh and not Pastor Dave. So Josh has a better way of handling her doubting, and Pastor Dave, like, he has also a chip on his shoulder. We find out randomly in an exposition dump through argument that his parents got sick and he took care of them, and Pearce like didn't come back to help him, and that's why he's actually mad at his brother.
Right, but we'll get to more those are coming out in the message of the film, like representation of Christianity.
Yeah.
So what did you think of the cinematography and the actual filmmaking techniques they used?
Right. So I'll do what I didn't like first, and then we'll do what we did like. I said this already. The establishing shots almost seem done by second, less experienced crew. It's weird because we don't need as many establishing. An establishing shot is when they change locations and they have like a shot of the location. So they're like they cut to a courthouse or a court scene. They show the courthouse first, and then they cut into the scene.
It's like a 90s sitcom. So like back in the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, if they were going to go back to the house and show the family, they show the house first, and then they're like, we're in the kitchen. You don't really need that anymore to be an adult. Like when you're watching a movie or something like that, if you've already seen the scene before, you kind of get the idea, we're back in the school or we're back in the church.
Right. Or if you just know, like if they cut to a courtroom, you're like, they're in court, but it's a stylistic choice. The other movies did that and they kept it. But I feel like those shots were done by like the original Pure Flix crew. I think Dave like wanted his people. I could see that. Like Universal steps in, but he's like, hey, these people still need a job. They still need, because they are the original people that helped make this. But that's all speculation on my part.
Well, for me, that just feels lazy. So what I mean by that is, we have those establishing shots, and if you're going to use it once or twice, great. But we use it over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Like we see the house again and again. We see the university, the
church.
Right. And so the church is shown so many times, that same outside shot of the church.
And as soon as you get inside the church, well, I know it gets burned in this movie, but we've seen it so many times that if you were to just cut to them in it, you would know they're in that church, that specific church.
I think what that does is it kind of talks about the intelligence you're expecting from the audience. Mm-hmm. If you're giving me establishing shots every single time you go to a new location, even if it's the same location over and over again, you're telling me you don't trust me as an audience to just go with it and trust you as a filmmaker. Now you got to show me everything, instead of just like, hey, let me figure it out, especially since I've been here before with you, because it's a journey, it's a story. If I've already been here with you in this story, I already know where we're supposed to be.
Yeah. And then we already talked about this too. I said too sloppy with the backstory. The sick parents and the prior beef about it was never explained or even told, or it wasn't even we didn't even learn about that in the other two movies when we learned about Pastor Dave. Like, I think all we knew is that his father was the pastor at that church before him.
Yeah.
There was none of this established beforehand.
Yeah. And I would go in further with that, where it's like having sensationalism and emotion, where there'd be like, here's this really deep emotional backstory, or here's this like traumatic event. Sensationalism and emotionalism do not make up for subpar writing. If you are trying to write a story, if you can't convince the audience to latch onto it naturally, and you have to try to force emotional backstory, whether it be a death, whether it be with the student's case, the boyfriend who commits the arson, instead of having him just be like, I just do not believe in the gospel, he's like, he has to have a traumatic event that gives him a reason not to believe. believe. That is not great writing, because every character in this franchise has a tragic backstory. And when you do that, none of it seems realistic, because there are going to be people who we've all met who just don't believe in the gospel because they don't want to believe. And there are very rarely any characters in this film that are naturally like, I just don't believe because I don't believe. There's always some kind of climactic, sensational, dramatic, romantic reason they don't believe the gospel, or they have like a hurt feelings. And it always has to have some kind of climactic reveal, like in the argument with the brother's like, you know, you disrespected me, you kicked me out of the home, well, you left me to tend to my parents alone. It's like, it had to be built towards like this big reveal rather than a natural conversation.
Yeah, there are definitely so many Christians, or not Christians. There's so many people who don't believe in the gospel because their life is great. It's fine. It's normal. They were raised by parents who are atheist or not Christian, and they feel no need to learn or believe about Jesus. You
know what I just thought would have been a great idea?
What?
You could have had the student say, oh, I don't believe because I took Professor Radisson's class.
Yeah.
And
we also talked about the whole thing about Josh possibly being the lawyer, but we'll get to that later.
But also, I thought about this just recently. Like, this movie would have been so good as the second movie, as the follow-up to Josh. Like, it says, 3 months later from the first movie, and Josh has dropped out because he wants to pursue ministry, and now there's fallout because of everything that happened at the college.
Yeah, I guess I can. Do I have it written down somewhere? I don't think I do, so I'll talk about it right now. So what I would have done with this script, so instead of having
Throw it in the trash.
Instead of having the random brother character be the lawyer, I would have set it a couple years in the future, not have Josh give up a law school, but have him be like just out of law school. He's a lawyer, and he's the one who comes to help defend Pastor Dave.
Because there are actual lawyers that defend religious cases.
Yes. And so I feel like that would have wrapped it up much more nicely. It would have involved him more, and it would have given his character more of a...
It would have made it so you had Josh, who's this fledgling young Christian, and having to watch this pastor he grew up with struggle with his faith. And the pastor's wrestling with the death of Jude, and then this student that committed arson, and now he's potentially losing his family church, and he's wrestling with God's purpose and everything, and God having sovereignty over everything, and yet everything's falling apart around him, and he's trying to decide his future. Have Josh come in, which Josh does this in the film. Josh is the moral compass of the film, but he is also like the genuine Christian in the film who's like has his head on straight. He doesn't have all the answers, but he has the trust in God and God's plan and Christ's influence in our lives.
I just realized he replaces Jude's character.
He also technically replaces Martin too.
Yeah, he replaces like Jude's presence for Dave, but what could have been more beneficial for his character and more fleshed out for him, like it would have felt like a continuation of his story and Pastor Dave's, is if he actually did become the lawyer, come back, they fight this court battle, he's once again debating, but now it's like with Pastor Dave starts to doubt. I feel like that was a missed opportunity,
because then he could have been debating the pastor this time, and not like proving Christianity like the first movie, but this time trying to wrestle with what it's like to be a Christian when your life doesn't work out the way you want it to. And instead, Josh kind of like pops up randomly in this, surprise, there's a Christian ministry on campus that we didn't know about, and feels like Josh has gotten this backstage character role when he could have been like a continuation of his main role in the first movie.
It would have been so much more cohesive as a story, as for both character and story, and like this world that we've built for 3 movies now.
But to be fair, like even if they had gone with this, it would have made more sense telling the story of a Christian life, because this movie is bent on Christians suffer so much and we have to fight and we have to endure because the world is so against us, and it's just like perseverance, but with like mainly focusing on us. But flipping it and doing this kind of idea what we've just come up with would have made it more realistic to where Pastor Dave is going through it. Pastor Dave is struggling, and that's a real struggle. Like everybody has a point in their life where just everything is just insurmountable. But having a brother in Christ walk beside you and counsel you through it, that's beautiful, but that's also life. That's realistic. And it wouldn't have been his rampaging through half of this film, having emotional breakdowns, hitting people, attacking people, losing his integrity as a believer, and then having a miraculous moment at the end where he's like, everything's cool now. We're good. Surprise.
Yeah. Last thing on what I didn't like about the filmmaking. We talked about this too a little bit. Not realistic enough stakes and ramifications. I specifically wrote down the news doesn't bring up. Okay, so this whole thing with the church and the university becomes a news thing. Like it's on the news, all the media circus. The news does not bring up enough about Dave. He doesn't bring up his recent jail time or the fact that he was on the jury of that case that literally. Like at this point it just happened. It happened like a year or so ago.
More importantly, they don't bring up the fact that he committed an assault on a student, which was made public.
Yeah. So there's so many things realistically they would have talked about with him that he had done. That they would have been like, he was on this jury for this case that was huge with this teacher and all this stuff. And then I also said the legality of the whole thing is questionable. So I have no idea how this really works, but I know that the church technically is a historical landmark. It's like 150 years old or something. I don't think they can just like get rid of it. I feel like there would have been more there that they wrote around that. But yeah, what did you not like about the filmmaking techniques?
I think we've kind of touched on it a lot. It's really sloppy storytelling. It is sensationalism. And honestly, my biggest pet peeve for any movie that's come out in the last 10 to 15 years, don't use CGI unless you know how to use CGI. There's a scene with the church on fire, and there are scenes where the church is actually on fire. And it's like, okay, this is dramatic. This makes me feel a little immersed. And then there's scenes where it's clearly CGI flames, and you're like, this is not great. This doesn't look good. And it makes them look cheap. It makes the film look C-list movie when if you don't know how to do it, don't do it.
Is there anything else about what you didn't like about the filmmaking techniques, or is that
No, I mean, really where it comes down to it, the filmmaking things that I don't like, it comes down to how they portray Christianity, how they portray storytelling, and how they make it into this, they're like, this is what real life is for Christians. And then they don't actually put it in real life. Nothing has consequences. And it's not realistic. Like they really want in this film to be like, here's a natural conversation that these people would have. And so they try to have like building relationship between the brothers and of the pastor and Pearce. But the problem is none of what they do is realistic. Like Pearce comes back kind of begrudging, like, I don't want to be here, but it's my brother. I kind of have to do this. He comes back and he starts like being a goofball, trying to be silly, trying to reconnect with his brother. And then they had this huge fallout thing, and the lawyer should have left as soon as the pastor had that, have the breakdown, had like these like screaming moments. He should have been like, if you can't compose yourself, then I'm heading out. And then he commits this assault. He should have been like, I'm done. I'm not helping you anymore. And so the conversations aren't realistic. Consequences aren't realistic. It makes it so this is like Christian sensationalism. It's Christian like emotionalism to get us afraid of reality, afraid of how to handle our faith, how to handle these situations. And when we do that, it's fear mongering, really what it is. And so that's when you tell stories like that, you're not telling stories, you're forcing a message across. And that's the difference between a good storytelling and propaganda.
Yeah. So we're going to move on to what we did like about filmmaking techniques.
So what are two or three things that you thought were pretty good about the filmmaking?
Yeah, I'll read them off real quick. Nicer cinematography, already talked about it. I liked the Pearce character and I liked his actor. I know that they didn't establish him very well, but I liked the acting I liked his actor. I think that he was enjoyable to watch. Not so many other B and C and D plots. We had like the other two movies had so many other subplots. This did not, and it felt better, tighter. We had a positive romantic relationship. So we have a female we have a female romantic subplot. We have a romantic subplot that's this new character, once again a random character, but she is actually supportive and helpful role to Dave. Much better than we've had before in the last two movies.
And the part of the reason why we're not listing the names of her or the student or the student's girlfriend is because they are barely mentioned in this film.
I know the student's girlfriend or the girl was named Keaton because it was a very unique name.
I was like, Keaton is usually a last name, but other than that, like these characters' names are barely ever functionally mentioned. They're like thrown around, but like it's not like they're dressed as that person.
Yeah.
I think for me, I have two more
real quick. Less Newsboys. We only get like one cutaway scene with the Newsboys, so that's great.
And then a remix of their theme song in the credits.
Yes. And then the last one, the brother had some legitimate criticisms about Dave. Dave is kind of a jerk this whole movie, and he kind of like the brother tells him so much in one scene, and I'm like, yeah, you're right. He is like not understanding or patient with you, or like he just assumes that he's right on every single thing. So yes, we actually kind of called out Dave's faults in this movie. So yeah, that I know we have to keep moving, but those were mine. So what do you have down for things you liked?
Well, most of the stuff we've already mentioned that I actually semi-appreciated. The one that we haven't really talked about is that for the first time, there aren't as many big name celebrities. For a movie that is now being endorsed and produced by Universal, there aren't any big names that are just like popping off the screen. And so I believe, since we've already established a couple of these characters, I believe that actually helps the film because it feels more natural. If they had done this for the first film, I don't think it would, because nobody was familiar with these characters. But we're third film in. We know Pastor Dave. We know Jude. We know Josh. We know the church. We know the overarching story. So we can kind of put it together in our head, so we can actually, these characters now have their own life that they don't need breathed into by a big name celebrity. You know, they can be standing on their own 2 feet. So I really like that it was like big budget, low budget, if that makes sense.
Okay, we're getting to the meat. This is the last thing we're going to talk about before we sign off. Okay, what did they get wrong in the message of the film, and what did they get right in the message of the film?
Right. My big pet peeve: actions have consequences, even for Christians. Actions have consequences even for Christians. And I love repeating that because, you know, we live in a world where some Christians believe that because they're Christians, they can get away with anything. You know, they have no ramifications for what they do. So the brother leaves his law practice. So the reason why I say that, brother leaves his law practice to go help his brother. And they're like, this is completely fine. He's the lead lawyer for his law practice, and he's dropping all these cases to help his brother. That is going to wreck his business. That is going to wreck him. And they just like, just handle it. We got this. I got this. The pastor Dave assaults a student and there's no consequences. He would be arrested again. And more importantly, this would be a huge thing that the college would be like, hey, guess what? You just assaulted one of our students on campus. Even though he did this crime, you broke the law, and we could use that as leverage to get this case closed. And then the arson. Like, the problem is, so the boy accidentally commits arson, accidentally commits manslaughter, goes to jail. The pastor's like, hey, I forgive him, thumbs up. And he's like, I forgive him, and we're going to fight to have his charges reduced from felony to manslaughter. And and then they release the student from jail. Yeah. And so even though you don't press charges for certain things, like the state can still be like, hey, no, this student was belligerent. This student, was not, he committed crimes, and we can he damaged property. He killed he ended a life.
Yeah. Manslaughter. Yeah. He would be charged for manslaughter. Like, he can't get away with that. No, legally.
It's not like, it's all right. He forgave you.
They're acting like the party they're acting like Dave has the power whether to prosecute him or not, but he doesn't.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the only thing he could probably drop with the charges would be the arson.
Yeah.
Because he owned the property. He doesn't own he doesn't own Pastor Jude's life, and you can't get away from the fact that the student committed a manslaughter. And so the state would still be like, he still killed somebody.
The best thing that Dave could do, and maybe they were trying to insinuate this, but the best thing that Dave can do is testify for him whenever he goes
But he doesn't know him.
I mean, yeah, but it's that's a whole other bag of worms.
We're not going to get into that. But that's what I mean. Big things happen in this film, and nothing comes of it. There's no follow-up. Another thing, a big thing that I had to pause the film because of, Pastor Dave says, I believe God's calling me to fight this. I believe God is calling me to fight against the college so I can keep my church. When in actuality, Pastor Dave's first job is to represent Christ to the community and to love others as Christ loved them, giving them the gospel. And when you put Christianity on display as this antagonistic, this not belief, but like it's so antagonistic, it's causing friction, it's causing problems. Paul tells us to be peacemakers with everybody if it's the best way we can do things. And they offered him money to just go ahead and head out. And the battle in his spirit of like, I don't want to leave this church. It's been in my family forever. He could have taken that money, beginning of the film, and gone and made a new church, started a house church, and given the money to the college ministry or the homeless ministry he was supporting. And he would have done more in that than he could have fighting in court.
Yeah, I think that they do semi-resolve this, like specifically the God called me to fight thing. So he does have the moment, and this is going to be folded in with what did they get right in the message of the film. I know you didn't like how they did it visually, but there's a moment where Pastor Dave finally like decides to just listen to what God has to tell him, and he comes to the conclusion, he's like, oh, God didn't call me to fight. God called me to just build his church, and his church is not a building, it's people. And so that's why he drops the charges, because he's like, yeah, this building doesn't mean anything. God cares about, like, he's like literally like spreading the gospel, spreading the word. And so that is true. That so far that's the best theological outcome we've gotten from these movies. I believe that the way that he finally he's like, I'm not going to fight anymore, like we're going to focus on what we need to do. So I will say that's something that they do kind of resolve. But yeah, you are right about the God called me to fight. That is a dangerous thing.
It's not the only film that's done that. Every single one of these films has had that narrative.
Yeah.
Josh,
yep.
God's calling me to fight.
Yep.
The teacher, God's calling me to fight.
Yep.
Dave, God's calling me to fight. And finally, in this one, he's like, oh, God's actually not calling me to do that.
He can fight his own battles.
Right. But also, I know, Christianity is represented by God first and foremost, and God is going to do with Christianity what God's going to do with Christianity. But as a pastor, you are the face of Christianity to a dying world. And so when you become belligerent, when you become antagonistic, when you are fighting and tooth and nail against a system that he's making up problems. The college is not trying to shut down Christianity. The students that are trying, there are student groups that are trying to shut it down, but the college is just trying to get the controversy off, because they also, they weren't going to shut down the college ministry. The college ministry was in a different building on campus. They were going to let the college ministry keep going. But I'm not going to keep going because I'm going to keep rambling. I just have a problem with these movies because it portrays Christianity as almost boneheaded. We don't understand logic. We don't make sense of things. The last thing I'm going to say, at the end of the film, Pastor Dave is with the dean, and he's in front of the burnt church, and he's like, guys, I'm going to drop the charges. We're going to leave the church. I'm going to let them demolish it. I was wrong. I want to push peace, love, and unity. And the crowd takes that to heart, and they all leave, because the crowd's protesting. They're screaming for the head of Pastor Dave. And he says, I want to push for peace, love, and unity. I want to push for forgiveness. And then the movie wraps. He doesn't mention the gospel. He doesn't mention Jesus' sacrifice. He doesn't mention Jesus, because Jesus died on the cross for his sins and forgave him, he wants to forgive the student. No, none of that. He doesn't mention the reason why he wants peace, love, and unity. He doesn't mention the heart of the gospel. He's a pastor. This is the prime opportunity in front of a crowd of probably about 200 people. He could give the gospel message, and he doesn't. And more importantly, most of these films don't give the gospel message.
Yeah, I have that written down. I have it on mine, so still haven't gone over the gospel, and they don't mention sin. We haven't really had to talk about sin and why it's crucial to understand in order to understand Jesus and to understand our relationship to God. God and what Jesus did.
Because the way they're portraying Christianity in these films is like, we're just an inspirational group. We're here to push unity and forgiveness. And
that did feel like that. It felt very politically correct at the end with the unity and the love. But at the same time, it was powerful with the whole like, hey, it was powerful with the like, we're going to forgive and we're going to push for love, but also I don't have to, like, he finally realized where he needed to put his energy and his focus, which is in, building a new church to continue his ministry. But what is the reason for you doing the ministry? It is to tell people about Christ, kind of conveniently left out. So it was like, you got very, very close. It got better and better, but there's still that just huge, crucial part missing, which is, oh yeah, God cares about people knowing about the truth of his son, Christ Jesus. And the fact that we are sinful, we are fallen, and that we need Christ and we need the gospel in order to regain our relationship with God. Not talked about really, not really even explained or like gone into in these movies, any of them. We have not really talked about the consequence and the importance of, the importance of sin. Sin is important in the way of we have to understand it and be disgusted with it and then repent of it. And that's just not, we don't talk about those in these movies. They don't come up. Not in the way that other things have been, really talked about and discussed. And so, yeah.
So do you have anything unique that you saw in the message that you're like, wow, this is not great?
We talked about two of my points. The one I have written that you didn't go over, I said that Dave is very arrogant throughout. We don't see Pastor Dave a lot throughout the other two movies. This one's about him. He comes off as very like arrogant, and I'm like, and you kind of like, oh, I'm automatically in the right, and I know what's best.
I mean, we do see that in the first two movies a little bit. So he's a side bit character in the first two movies. But how many times is he's like, I got all the answers. He's very laid back. He's very chill. And he's in like these weird influential roles,
right,
where he's almost like the sensei. He's the mage. He has all these answers that people come to him, and he's just kind of like hovering in the background of like all this knowledge and being the wise man of the group. And then he gets to this movie, he's finally the center stage, and he
falls short.
Yeah, he has not grown at all in 3 movies.
He does grow in this movie. They take the time to have him grow in this movie. It's weird because his brother really kind of hands it to him and is like, hey, you are not as great as you think you are, which I don't think he thinks he's great, but subconsciously he thinks he's like...
But in his actions, he's portraying his real mindset about himself.
Yeah.
But, and to be fair, he doesn't really grow because he has a chance to own up to his mistakes with his family. And his brother openly reveals heartache and like brokenness in his spirit. And as a pastor, his job is to minister to the brokenhearted, to be a shepherd, and to give the gospel. He doesn't give it to his own family. His own family is broken, and he lets him go. He doesn't try to repair it. He doesn't try to, hey, I messed up and I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Does none of that.
Yeah.
His brother's literally crying out for help, and he ignores him. And that broke my heart, because this is supposed to be a pastor who's supposed to be the reflection of Christ to the community, and he can't even help his own, and it's not, but the thing is, it's not like this dramatic thing that you're kind of like, this is, unique storytelling. He makes this huge life change at the end, and he gets it right, but then he still leaves his brother hanging at the end, and you're like, yeah,
they heavily imply that they do reunite off screen later, but I feel like it was needed on screen. They could have made time for that, especially with what the story they built up with them. Okay, I'm going to go over what I liked about the message in the film, what I thought they got right, and then I'll kick it to you, and then we will be signing off. Okay, I thought they had a really, really good scene with Josh and Keaton. Keaton was the girl whose boyfriend accidentally killed Jude, on doubt. So she comes to Josh and is like, I'm having doubts. I'm not supposed to have doubts if I'm a good Christian. And Josh is like, no, it's okay to doubt. It's human to doubt. I was like, even John the Baptist had doubts.
Which was, and I'm going to kind of jump in here because I loved that.
Yeah, that was a great scene.
Because at first you're like, where is he going with this? And then he brings up a story that not a lot of people who, read the Bible know about it, is that John the Baptist, proclaimed Jesus, loved Jesus, was
From
like
the womb.
on the front line representing Jesus, gets arrested, is going to be not hanged, but he's going to be beheaded
eventually
because of his faith, and he doubts and he worries that Jesus is not who he says he is, if he's doing this all in vain, because all John has to do is say, I'm done believing this, and he can go home. And so when they bring this up, I'm like, brilliant.
Yeah, it was brilliant. It was very well written. I don't know who wrote that scene. I need to look into who writes the scripts for these, but I thought it was very well done. I love that they were like, hey, doubting is okay because once you work through them, it makes your faith stronger. God calls to us in our doubts. And I was like, yes. So that was a great scene. We both really loved it. And then the ending, finally getting it right. I'm so proud is what I wrote. They finally put down the swords and preached the truth about God caring the most about people and his eternal people and less about current and fading affairs. The past two movies have put so much emphasis on like this, and me and Grant talked about this for the first one. God cares so much more about the eternal than he does about you winning an argument. He cares so much more about your relationship with him and your faith than he does about you coming out on top. And this movie finally didn't have like the big win. We won. We won. Yeah, in your face ending, and was finally like, no, like we're just going to focus on what God really wants us to do as his people. And that I was like, claps, snaps for them. I was very proud. So those are the two things that I thought that was great about the message in the film. And I'll kick it to you for you to talk real quick so we can wrap it up.
Yep. So one thing we've not mentioned is there's a new pastor on the scene. So when
the Southern guy,
when Jude leaves, a new inspirational pastor comes into Dave's life to guide him in the right direction. And so Jude passes away. His role in the past two movies is to be the grasshopper on the shoulder, the cricket on the shoulder.
Oh, Jiminy Cricket.
The Jiminy Cricket for Pastor Dave, the little voice in his head. And Jude passes away and arrives a new pastor. I don't even know if they say his name.
They do, but it was like
again,
twice.
they really do poorly with naming the characters and then emphasizing their names.
He only says it like twice. He says like, hey.
So, but basically what happens that this church adopts Pastor Dave's body of believers as they look for a new place to preach. And so Pastor Dave has just been kind of going there with his body of believers, attending this church. And so Pastor Dave goes to seek counsel from this new pastor, and this pastor calls him out and says, hey, maybe you're not supposed to be fighting. Maybe you're not supposed to be doing this, because he's like, who called you to fight? Who asked you to do this? Your job is supposed to love like Christ loved, sacrificially. You're supposed to be willing to lay down your cares and concerns for somebody else. You're supposed to seek after forgiveness and peace by representing Christ. He's like, Christ did all these things. He got, made fun of, he got mocked, he got hit, he got spit on, and yet he knew his job was to reach out to those who were in dire need, who were the innocent, who were the broken, who were the hurting, and bring them the gospel. That is your job. Your job is not supposed to be on the front lines wielding a sword. Your job is to be the peacemaker, to represent Christ to those who need it. And he calls them out, and it's beautiful and it's great. My other point, Josh is back in the atmosphere. Josh is back, and instead of, he does have all the answers, but it's okay because he acts as the moral compass of the movie, but as a very minor role. I kind of wish we had explored more of like, hey, he's also leading the ministry on campus. What is that like? What is it?
They just spring that whole thing on us.
They act like you're supposed to have known that the entire time, but he's the ministry leader on campus. He's older. He's a little wiser. He's a little more seasoned in his faith, but at the same time, he left his job, his passion, and I feel like that was a bit of a letdown. But he is basically guiding the side characters of this film, and
he takes over Jude's role.
Yeah,
they killed Jude, and then they just put him with Josh's character.
They put Josh in, but he also has a really great moment where he confronts Pearce. and he does what Pastor Dave's supposed to do and talk about, hey, it's okay to be a Christian and be in law. It's okay because Christianity is supposed to, fight the good fight and it's supposed to represent the innocent. He does say the most grossest line of all time. He says, Jesus was the first social warrior.
Social justice warrior. I was like,
That's not.
Get that out of there.
That's not
Cut
Jesus.
That
That's
out.
not Jesus. No.
X that out because that's not what we need to say.
I had a very big problem with that because that's social justice warrior is not what Jesus was, and that's just because it has bad connotations. And
it's just so muddy of a term, and also I feel like it's kind of like in the 70s when they try to make with like Jesus Christ Superstar. If you want to watch more about my depictions of Jesus through history, I have a whole video about it on our YouTube channel. You can go ahead and watch that. But I mentioned in the 70s they try to make Jesus into like a hippie, like social revolutionary leader. That's not what Jesus. That's not his point. That's not his. And I understand what they were kind of trying to do, but it fell hard for me. I hated that they used that calling him that.
They were just trying to stay hip and relevant with the movie, and it fell super flat, and it actually made it kind of gross. But other than that, I honestly, once again, the side characters in these films make the films worth watching because the main characters are shallow. The main story is illogical at best. Stuff that doesn't make sense. Why it even be a problem, especially going to court. 2 different movies. These court cases don't make sense. They
never get to court to this one, though.
It's assumed.
They never...
It's brought before a judge.
Oh, okay. It's not like the second one, though.
Yeah, but it's brought before a judge, and the charges are dropped just before the court case gets to court. But they take it before 2 judges, actually, in this film to get...
Oh, yeah. He, tracks down that one judge and church.
Anyways, as you can tell, I'm not a huge fan of these movies because the stories don't make sense. They're illogical, and they make Christians look like we are scared of our own shadow.
I will say this is my favorite one out of all the ones we've seen. I think it has the best message at the end, it's most theologically accurate message.
For a movie series that doesn't mention the gospel.
Maybe we'll get there with number 4. I don't know, but
if it takes 4 movies in a franchise about Christianity to talk about the gospel.
That's fair. Still, this is the best one in my opinion out of all the ones we've seen. That will be it for this entry into the God's Not Dead franchise. The next podcast will be the last one for the God's Not Dead series. We will finally be done with this film series. He's just so sad that we don't get to watch these movies anymore, right, Will?
I'm ready for a Christian movie that actually has good storytelling, good character development, and makes Christianity look coherent, look logical, and look like we know what we're talking about. Half the time, any Christian movie nowadays is like, these Christians are kind of like bumbling through life, and then God just kind of like reminds them, you're not supposed to bumble through life. Here's all the answers, and here everything wraps up perfectly at the end. It makes me sick because it makes us look like we don't know what we're talking about. So when a non-believer sees these films, it makes us look like we're living in an alternate world.
Okay, so that'll be it for us. We are going to sign off here. We hope that you guys enjoyed our 3rd installment of the God's Not Dead series, and we will be seeing you next time. I'm Hannah.
And I'm Will.
Okay, see ya. Bye.